In this first section, I would like to cover the basics of cloud computing and giving you an Azure overview. In this section, we're going to take a look at an introduction to cloud computing acronyms and concepts, so mainly highlighting some terminology that is pretty important when we're talking about cloud computing, and in the second section covering an overview of Microsoft Azure. So let me start with the first video, cloud computing acronyms and concepts. In general, cloud computing has three main acronyms. We're talking about private cloud, public cloud, and hybrid cloud. Now let me describe each of every of these terminologies. We're talking about private cloud as a combination of IT infrastructure, which basically means servers, storage, networking, and using a hypervisor technology, which is running in a centralized data center and mainly consumed by the organization itself. This could be a hosting provider, could be an in-house on-premises data center managed by a specific organization. Where the public cloud is completely the opposite from a private cloud, we're talking about, again, a combination of IT infrastructure, which is again running in a centralized data center, but it's offered by a service provider to be consumed by many different organizations. So the main difference is that in a private cloud, it's mainly managed and deployed by the organization that is using its own infrastructure in a more centralized way, in a more optimized and managed approach. Where public cloud is obviously the same centralized data center, managed and offered by a service provider, but it's not using it itself. It's offering the data center as a service to other organizations. And then we have another acronym, hybrid cloud, which basically points to the fact that an organization, an enterprise, is using a combination of private cloud and public cloud infrastructure. So part of their IT environment is running in their own managed data center in an on-prem scenario, and part of the infrastructure is being used out of a public cloud. So from an architectural perspective, it's a private cloud managed by the customer itself, the public cloud managed by a hosting provider, and the hybrid cloud basically means an organization using the two data center services in one single solution. Now, some other acronyms that you need to know when talking about cloud computing is IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS as the prime ones. IaaS standing for infrastructure as a service, PaaS means platform as a service, and SaaS pointing to software as a service. And some other ones, disaster recovery as a service, backup as a service, and as you can imagine, the list is not really limited to these 5 or 6, but it depends a bit on the specific scenario. Like MaaS, management as a service, is another one that I'm just thinking of right now. Now, the prime ones are IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Any cloud vendor, a small hosting provider, a bigger one like Amazon AWS or Azure, are mainly talking about IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So let me zoom in a little bit more on these acronyms. IaaS, infrastructure as a service, mainly points to providing virtual machines, networking, storage, VPN connectivity for remote management or remote hybrid setups, and overall systems management. So we're mainly talking about the physical data center layer. Although quite important, as a customer, as a consumer of IaaS, you're never really touching or having access to the physical data center component itself. In the second category, platform as a service, we're mainly talking about websites, web applications, using the platform for application development without being responsible or even being managing the underlying infrastructure. Another one could be streaming services, using it for big data solutions and backup and disaster recovery. So we're mainly talking on the application layer, the development layer, and we're not responsible for the underlying infrastructure. The third option, software as a service, is only pointing towards consuming the software solution. Easy examples: email, Exchange Online, Office 365 is software as a service. As a customer, you're using the email solution, you're using collaboration out of CRM, for example, but as a customer, you're not responsible for managing, maintaining the Exchange servers or the SharePoint Online servers. That's managed by the cloud vendor. Cloud storage could be another solution. So again, it's all about software and not at all about the infrastructure anymore. Now, you know the acronyms of cloud computing. It might be interesting to talk a little bit about some cloud computing concepts. Overall, irrelevant from which cloud vendor we're talking about, there are a certain list of characteristics that really are specific to cloud computing. First and foremost, it's an on-demand self-service. Could be out of a specific department or even out of the full organization. Another one is broad availability. Could be on a regional aspect, could also be global. And I'll talk about that later on when I'm talking about an Azure overview, highlighting the number of data centers Microsoft is having available all over the world. Scalability and elasticity are quite important in a cloud computing concept. It means that whenever we're running a cloud service, could be a virtual machine, could be a web app, scalability and elasticity is built in. Scalability pointing to the fact that your underlying infrastructure, like the virtual machine, for example, could scale, or the web application, the website, can scale up, scale down based on some policies you define or based on the number of requests. So basically guaranteeing that your application, your service is always available. And then another one, rapid deployment. As you will find out later on in this course, it's really easy to create your subscription. And within your subscription, it's really easy to deploy your services. Like a virtual machine in Azure, or if you want Amazon AWS, it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to deploy and it's up and running. Where, if you think back to the typical departmental IT services, if any department wants a new infrastructure, they need a 3-tier application infrastructure or architecture. Depending on the IT services department, depending on the overall provisioning cycle, it could take days, weeks, or even months from ordering all the way down to having your architecture available to the end user. And then some other ones more about costs. There's no upfront costs in cloud computing. It's what we call pay per use, and you don't have to buy any upfront licensing schemas for your software. Although it depends a little bit on specific scenarios. But in most cases, it's a pay per use. So like again, Office 365 as an easy Microsoft example, if you are using 1,000 Exchange Online users, then you pay for those 1,000 users. If after a few months your company has grown to 1,500 users and they're all using Exchange Online, then you start to pay for those 1,500. Where in a typical on-prem, I would like to call it a legacy way of operating, you deploy an Exchange server and then you buy the licenses for those 1,500 users from day one. Now, in giving you some names, typical well-known public cloud computing vendors, there's Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, VMware as a joint venture with AWS, as they announced at their latest conference a couple of weeks ago, IBM Smart Cloud using SoftLayer as an underlying technology, and Rackspace as a global hosting provider. And besides these partners, there are obviously many other ones as well. In this video, you'll learn about cloud computing acronyms and cloud computing concepts, and I would like to welcome you in the next video in which I'm going to walk you through an overview of Microsoft Azure.